Thanks for coming out. My name is Dr. Landon Westfall. I have a Ph.D. in medical microbiology, and I'm fascinated with things you can't see that can kill you. It's a little morbid, but it fascinates me from a very young age. Now, the film you're going to watch tonight is a very good film. It actually was discussed in multiple areas of the biomedical and biowarfare divisions of conferences that I've been to. But the movie for me that kind of got me, piqued my interest, was Outbreak. That was the first one. Can't beat Dustin Hoffman and Morgan Freeman. They can narrate my life. So I hope you enjoy it. But tonight, I wanted to talk just a little bit about if you know how a pandemic starts. And a lot of times the media, especially in this day and age, there's inflammatory rhetoric, there's clickbait, there's all kinds of things that will get you to click on something if it makes you fearful or curious enough to click on it. So tonight I thought I'd talk just a little bit about some basics and then use something that's near and dear to my heart, the influenza virus, as a case study for a pandemic, and use the 1918 influenza pandemic as a case study for how pandemics start. So the first thing we'll talk about is there is a lot of terminology. Terminology is everywhere. Google this, Siri, what's that? Alexa, tell me something. You can go out there and find anything. The key things that you want to be key on is the two words are pandemic, endemic, and epidemic. Now, the very basic definition for endemic is that the disease is always in the local community. So there are certain areas of the world in which there are disease, like dengue fever is endemic in India. We have tick-borne encephalitis and Rocky Mountain spotted fever are endemic to the southeast United States because of the tick population. Those are endemic. When we get to the terms epidemic and pandemic, epidemic is when we have levels of disease that are far above what's normally observed. So in this instance, we always get sick. There's strep throat, there's influenza, there's stomach viruses that go through. Those are just normal types of diseases. But whenever you see a large population of the same area start to become sick with the same disease, then you see what we call a local outbreak or an epidemic as it spreads throughout a region. When we get to the pandemic level is when that epidemic actually branches off to different continents and different parts of the world. And by that definition, you can see that it could start out in the UK, spread its way to India, across to China, and you can see how that works. Now, all these in modern ages, actually pandemics are more prevalent because of our mode of transportation. In the early ages of pandemics in which we didn't have the medical intervention that we have now, people would often perish because they couldn't get the medical intervention. Now you could jump on a plane and be a carrier, become symptomatic, 12 hours after you get off the plane, and you're on a brand new continent. And whoever you touch, if you ever go to the airport, and Contagion, the movie, will do a really good job of freaking you out about showing you how you can't touch anything when you walk out of someplace. It's okay, just wash your hands, but that's how pandemics will spread. And that's one thing the movie will really do good tonight, to kind of show you how the origin of a simple outbreak can then spread to the globe. So it's got some Hollywood in it, but for the most part, the science is pretty sound. All right, so let's talk about past pandemics. And I put some up here for things that you may recognize and some things you may not. Now, we all know that measles has been in the news recently about the current outbreaks, local outbreaks that we've had in the United States, and we've seen some across the world. But this is not the first time that it's happened. I lumped together smallpox because smallpox is kind of a forgotten disease because we have basically eradicated that off the planet and it hasn't really re-emerged anywhere else. But you can see that some of these pandemics reach back many, many years ago. And some of the more important ones would be the Antonine Plague, which is actually something that happened during the Hun era. That was the first era when smallpox reared its head. And then there's something that you probably knew about but never put a finger on is the Columbian Exchange. That's basically Columbus. When the Spaniards arrived to the Caribbean and South America in 1492, they brought with them the diseases, and in this case, the smallpox and measles. And one thing you may not have actually thought about is Fijian measles. There was a pandemic that started in Fiji. That was originated in Australia and was carried to the island and decimated almost 40% of the island before it was curtailed. Now, we all know about bubonic plague. The Black Death is something that we learn about in school. Every grade school kid learns about this. It ends up decimating 60% of the European population. Over 200 million people were killed. But what people don't realize is that the Black Death wasn't the first instance of the bubonic plague. It was actually detected in what we call the Justinian plague way back in 541. And then again, it reared its head with Columbus. Now, bubonic plague is carried by fleas that hang around with rats and other livestock. When the Spaniards came in 1492, the fleas and the rats came with them. A little history. I talked about flu's been around for a while. The derivation or the etiology of the word influenza is actually from the 15th century Italy. They described as the sickness was influenced by stars. And if you know about what we call the flu season now, in the sky there are certain constellations that are visible during the flu season that we call from late September until March. There's a certain number of constellations that are only visible. And therefore, the Italians at the time thought the sickness was influenced by stars, and that eventually turned into influenza. There have been 14 influenza pandemics that have been recorded. There's probably been likely a lot more in remote populations. Just to give you kind of an idea of how they've progressed over time, we've had 3 in the 16th century, 4 in the 18th century, 2 in the 19th century, and then 5 in the 20th century, and 1 so far in the 21st century. So we'll talk a little bit about how and the prevalence of those and how they've gone down and severity of those have gone down based on the impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic. So this is going to be a little sciencey. You don't have to just, I'm just going to go through it as an explanation to help you understand. When you hear someone say H1N1 or H3N2 or B influenza virus, what that actually means. So there are 3 known strains that predominantly infect humans. It's A, B, and C. A lot of you probably knew there was an A strain because that's what we hear about mostly on the news. But we also have B strains. B strains are typically not as pathogenic in young, healthy, and immunocompetent individuals. And we rarely see influenza C in a human infection. So A is the dominant one, and A is usually the one that causes the most mortality. They are called that because they have a receptor on the outside of the virus that's called hemagglutinin, and that's the H. And then they have another protein on the outside that's called neuraminidase, and that's the N. So the 2 main things that the virus will bind to is H1, N1 means hemagglutinin number 1, and neuraminidase number 1. And as you see the different derivations of it from H5N1, H7N9, those are all indications of unique proteins for the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase. Influenza also infects almost every mammal on the planet. And some of these you're probably not surprised, chickens, pigs, humans. Some of them you might be surprised. Whales. Most people don't think, how does a whale get flu? Can't really hang out with a pig. Does encounter a bird, but for the most part it's submerged in the water. So how does that happen? And most of the instances we consider it to be a bird interaction with the whale when they're sunbathing or when they're close. But some other interesting ones are horses. Dogs are severely affected by flu. There was an outbreak of an H3N2 strain in Chicago in the dog kennels that caused a number of dogs to die. It's as severe in dogs. Interesting thing is the strains that affect humans typically can't be transmitted to dogs, although there's been some rare occasions where they've seen that. The 2 main ones that affect us are going to be birds and pigs. And pigs are the incubator for most influenza viruses. Pigs can actually be infected with multiple viruses and they can intermix and then they can be transmitted to humans. Anybody ever been to a county fair and petted a pig? There you go. That's how flu can transmit. A couple years ago, there was a Midwestern flu that popped up at an agricultural fair that was traced back to a swine at a county fair and ended up killing a middle-aged lady because she was immunocompetent, but nonetheless, that transmission occurs on a daily basis. So how do influenza pandemics happen? 3 main routes. Birds to humans, birds to pigs, then pigs to humans, or humans to pigs. Those are your 3 routes. Each time you're infected with the flu virus, when it comes out of your body, it will be unique. You can then infect someone else, which will make it unique. And the probability of the virus, by the time it gets through 5 people, once it leaves you, it'll be a completely different virus, although it will be considered an influenza virus. The flu adapts to its host and comes out with a little bit of the host every time. With pigs, they can recombine these and make a pandemic. The most pathogenic strains that we encounter as humans is coming directly from birds. And when they make that jump, the mortality rate for some influenza viruses can be as high as 60% in a population. So, the 1918 influenza pandemic, it has been characterized as the greatest medical holocaust in history. And you ask, well, most people forgot about it. 100 million people worldwide died in a span of about 26 months. Just to put that in context, 200 million people died from the Black Plague, or from the Black Death. That took 10 years. So flu was able to kill more people in a short amount of time than any other infectious disease that we've come encountered with. So why was that the case? Well, as you no doubt know now, in order for us to prevent flu infection, we have to be able to have hygiene and sanitary practices and wash your hands and disinfect and things of that nature. But in the years leading up to 1918, they didn't have any of that knowledge. In fact, they described sicknesses as supernatural forces. This picture here is depicting something called miasma, that was some type of entity that caused people to be sick. They then had all kinds of homeopathic remedies. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a thing called asthma cigarettes. I wouldn't think that's one way to treat asthma. And on top of that, it's cannabis. But that was what they were dealing with in the late 19th century, early 20th century on how to treat this. Until a couple of important individuals that led the advancement for basic epidemiology and disinfection. Some of those are listed here. This picture here is of actually Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale actually came up with the idea of sanitizing bandages in battlefield in order to prevent gangrene and other types of infections from war wounds. These individuals, Jon Snow, not Game of Thrones Jon Snow, just make sure. He was one of the first father of epidemiology that actually tracked down a cholera outbreak in London in the late 1800s. Semmelweis and Lister and even Nightingale, they all were part of this whole disinfectant on how to prevent disease from spreading. But the crazy thing is they didn't know what they were trying to prevent, because it wasn't until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch that the germ theory actually came about. And that's when Louis Pasteur's famous experiment of the swan neck vases, in which you put broth on one side and let air on the other, that he was able to show that the germs were carried in the air. And at that point, they were able to isolate them. And then Robert Koch identified them with a gram stain. He also was the first to identify anthrax. And that's when we finally figured out that what was causing disease was actually small germs. Now, they didn't have the names that we call them today of bacteria and viruses. They called them germs. But nonetheless, this was all the way up until 1866. One other thing for this one is that viruses technically weren't even discovered until late 1900s. The late 1800s. And so 1892 into 1918, back then, was not a very long time at all, because of the medical advancements were so small. And so they barely knew what a virus was before the 1918 hit. So what was happening in the world at the time? Well, 1918, for those who remember history, World War I. In the United States, it happened to be a very cold year. That we entered the war in 1917. We started mobilizing troops. We started putting them in camps for training. We moved them all. There was about 35 different camps across the United States. There were 2 here in Alabama. About 50,000 people, 50,000 troops were stationed there. They were in tents that basically looked like a sardine can. They had like 10 soldiers in each of those tents, out in the cold. These were young men. They were robust. They were strong. But also in mobilizing the war movement, we actually increased urbanization. Industrialization took off. We needed steel. We needed weapons. We needed boats, we needed tanks. All that stuff was taking into place, and a lot of people were moving into the cities, becoming densely populated areas in order to work in the factories. And then, of course, the big one is most of the doctors and nurses were drafted into the wartime effort to take care of the soldiers while they were in theater. So that left a depletion of physicians and doctors. In this case, almost 30% of physicians and 9,000 nurses were deployed overseas. Now think about it now, in this day and age, we don't think that's 9,000 nurses, could be UAB hospital, right? So here, 9,000 was a large portion of what the nursing population was in the United States at the time. So that's all happening. So in 1918, I'm sure you've heard this before, but it was often called the Spanish flu. And it's not historically accurate. Epidemiological studies have shown that actually the Spanish flu originated in Santa Fe, Kansas. The reason why it was called the Spanish flu was during the wartime, the media and papers were only reporting propaganda or censoring themselves. And Spain, during the World War, was unaffiliated and reported the outbreak in their country free of censorship. And so it was always attached to Spain as being the ones that reported the most about this influenza pandemic. So in Santa Fe, Kansas, they had young men, strong, robust men, unexpectedly start to die. And then at this point, one of the big camps at the time, Camp Funston, had almost 1,000 hospitalized within 2 weeks after this initiation. This was March 4th, 1918. Then soldiers at that point, because they didn't know what they were dealing with, because these were young soldiers, they were supposed to be robust, they then moved these soldiers to other camps across the nation. And as they were being moved, foci of infection popped up at each one of these camps. And each one of these soldiers would eventually end up on the East Coast in Philadelphia, and the New York and Boston areas in order to board boats to travel to Europe. So as you can see, it was almost a perfect domino effect of infection as we went around, and then they all boarded a ship for 4 weeks to cross the ocean and showed up on Europe, and a lot of them were near death or died on the voyage on the way to Europe for the World War I. So at that time, what was left when the soldiers went to Europe was communities in shambles from the infection. And they didn't know what it was. Again, understanding the idea of what a virus wasn't understood. In fact, they used to tell people to leave your windows open so that tuberculosis, pneumonia, and whatever else could fly through your house could be removed as a way of trying to stem the infection. We know that doesn't work. But what we also didn't know is that people were not communicating because this was wartime. So the country did not hear it from the government. We didn't have a Department of Human Health. We didn't have public health. We didn't have people coming. So it was upon the Americans' individual towns to disseminate how to control this. So one of the things that had to be done is that we had to have caregivers for the sick. And with most of the nurses being deployed for the military, this started up nursing corps. And when we had nursing corps, we didn't have physicians. So we had pharmacists who created tinctures and other compounds to try to battle it. A lot of old-timey medicine in the early days was using arsenic-based medicine in order to treat disease. My great-grandmother gave me castor oil to cure everything. So they turned to pharmacists for leadership or medicine. One of the interesting things of this time that continues today is the Red Cross was actually taking shape as we know it today. That went around to support local communities. They were sprung up into the towns. Towns became so afraid of the disease that they passed laws. There's a town in Texas that still has a law in the books that says you can't spit. That's a direct result of this 1918 flu, because they couldn't figure out how the disease was transmitted, so they passed these radical, weird laws in order to try to prevent infection. Another thing that happened is that you had to take care of getting the infirm out of the healthy population and get them isolated. So you had to have those move them. You had to, this was one of the good ones I always liked, is leave your window open to prevent tuberculosis. So, or pneumonia or influenza. And even then at that point, they called it influenza, but they didn't know it was an actual virus because it hadn't been identified as such. This was an interesting photo from Boston. Barbers, before we had razors in our own houses, everyone had to go to a barber shop to get a shave. Barbers were wearing masks, which were basically just linen to prevent the exposure of flu. Bostonian police in the South Ward would walk around with masks on to try to prevent. All kinds of society was going into shambles because they didn't know what was going on. And that's the biggest problem with these types of events, is that misinformation can lead to fear, and fear leads to radical laws being passed and people doing crazy things. Things in the paper were mostly locally based. There was no national news on anything. It was mostly how this affects local informations. They shut down dance halls. In the early 1900s, that was akin to going to the movie theater or going to the arcade. Dance halls were closed, churches were closed, social clubs were closed. People retreated back to their houses because they were afraid of getting sick. And the country became very, very much isolated because of the threat of disease. And of course, you've probably seen this one. This is the ultimate makeshift infirmaries that popped up in order to house the sick and infirm that were in all major cities at the time to try to isolate the sickness from the healthy population. And then there were quarantine signs that were placed on doors. Now, you've seen this in movies before, where they've marked the houses with X's or they've quarantined those. Just going back to the movie Outbreak, same idea here. They would literally put signs on here that said, "Keep out of the house." And of course, it's gone societal when kids have jump rope rhymes as they sing it. And this is the one that was very, very much popular during that time. Again, on the notion of leaving the window open so we could influenza. So it was quite a thing. But again, think about it during this time. The paper, the radio were the main forms of communication. Those were controlled by like 3 companies, and then there were local stations. So there wasn't the mass information that we have today. So pretty much everyone was isolated. So there were 3 waves of the pandemic that hit. First one started in June of 2018. That was relatively benign. You can see it here on this graph with this little bitty bump right here. The big one, if you will, the big one was the second phase that happened in October. That one from October to December had more people die than any other phase. This is kind of representative of this spike in graphs. If I get this to work, doesn't work. And then you'll have the third phase that happened later on in 1919, in February to April 1919. What you also notice in this graph, if you can see it, is that you can kind of see a shift in the American cities versus the European cities. Mostly you'll see that with London. That's kind of indicative of as the troops were being moved into theater and as the virus spread, you can see the shift in mortality rates go up in these cities in Europe. So the symptoms for this type of pandemic strain were your classic flu symptoms. But one of the interesting things that were differentiated from most of the flu, as you understand it, would be that there was acute respiratory distress normally in the flu season, the 18 to 45-year-olds are the safe group from the infection because of the robust of the immune system, their competency. This one actually caused more deaths than the 18 to 45 group. And actually the very old and the very young were actually somewhat protected, because the younger you are, the more robust you are, the stronger your immune system is, and they generate something called cytokine storms. And cytokine storms are a blitzkrieg attack by your immune system that basically destroys a lot of tissue, organs, things of that nature as the infection goes to the body. There's also something known as purple death, because acute respiratory distress would cause your lungs to shut down, which would lead you to turning, or the patient turning blue, causing cyanosis because of the acute respiratory distress. And then probably the number one killer for most people was secondary bacterial pneumonia. Almost, I think a recent paper came out that said something like 75% of the deaths could be attributed to bacterial pneumonia. And you're probably thinking, well, why not just give them an antibiotic? Well, antibiotics weren't discovered until 1928. So one could say the greatest medical holocaust of our time could have been prevented if we had antibiotics in that regard. And that's what's curtailed the pandemics since 1918, is because of the advances we made with antibiotics. So this one would just give you kind of details on the fatality rate. when it comes to the United States, you'll see the number one city that was adversely affected was Philadelphia. Again, it was thought to be because that's where the soldiers grouped before being shipped out to the European theater. The fatality rate for this one was 2.5%. Normally for a pandemic is 0.1%, and I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot of percentage points, but just do the math for 6 billion people and that'll give you an idea of what 0.1 is and what 2.5% will be, the difference in the number of deaths. There were 675 deaths in the United States alone. 100 million worldwide is the estimate. It'll probably fluctuate between 50 and 100 million. The interesting thing about it is only 16 million people died in World War I. And this was going on at the same time. So we had 100 million, we had 16 million die in the war. In the United States, more soldiers died from the flu than actually died in war. And that's how bad this pandemic was and how much it decimated. And that was, if it's happening in the United States, you can imagine what happened in the UK and Germany, even Russia. And it was so bad because it was striking that 18 to 45-year-olds that the life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years for this one year of 1918. And that was a huge drop. And you can kind of see that. Now, we've gone back up, thank goodness, but that was a huge drop. All right, so what about Alabama? I always bring in a little bit of local flair. So those of you know about Birmingham and the Magic City and the history associated with that. Birmingham at the time only suffered from about 225 influenza-related deaths, but we did have 2 Army camps that were stationed in northern and southern Alabama. They were both incapacitated with illness, as in they shut down. The city of, there was, I believe in Huntsville or north of there was only one pharmacist that survived from being ill that was basically serving the entire town for medical. And so we were hit pretty hard here in the state of Alabama. All right, so I always like to talk about what we learned because pandemics lead us to advancements. Regardless of the number of deaths that happen, there's always advancements that are made. We learn. That's what we do as a society. So this is where I like to say science comes into play because after the 1918 pandemic, the world was ravaged both by war and by sickness. And it took a long time for us to start communicating again. But luckily when we started doing that, we started making some pretty big discoveries. So one of the things is isolating influenza as a virus. And they couldn't do that for the longest time because the only way they knew how to passage or actually grow the virus was in animals. So they would use pigs. That's costly, that's expensive, it's tough. And so one of the advancements that came up, it was in 1935. They were able to start growing the influenza viruses and fertilized hen eggs. And that's something that I still do today in my research. We still use that process. And so we were able to start passaging them and start working with them more easily so that we could start understanding them more. And so when we started looking at how do you detect influenza virus, well, then we came up with hemagglutination. That protein I talked about, hemagglutinin, will bind red blood cells to the virus and form like a little lattice structure. So I don't know if any of you have seen red blood cells as they separate out, if you've ever given blood and seen them separate out. But what happens is when they agglutinate, they look like cotton candy in the vial. And that's what we call agglutination. So now we have a way to identify them. And then we had the first vaccine come out in 1938. Now, I don't know if anybody recognizes the first name. You probably should. Jonas Salk is credited with generating the polio vaccine that saved a whole generation of kids. But he also, before he did that, he worked on the very first flu vaccine in 1938. And that's him there in the middle, along with, I forget what his name is. That's an entertainer there. I forget, there was a show a little bit before my time. And then in 1944, we get another round of vaccines. This one's even better than the 1938. Then we start vaccinating our soldiers. And if those who don't know over history, soldiers are the guinea pigs for vaccines. That's the way it works because military is not a democracy. So, but they did that because they learned their lesson from World War I. They sent the soldiers vaccinated, so whatever sickness they ran across, they were going to have a repeat of them bringing it back. And then 1946 and 1947, we finally figured out that flu viruses change every year. So just imagine all the battling we've been doing since 1918, and then we realize 30 years later that, oh yeah, they change every year. So now we have to start a whole global response, and that triggered the formation of the World Health Organization, which a lot of you know, WHO, in 1948. And then they initiated the surveillance program in 1952, which is currently still ongoing and very much a part of the World Health Surveillance Program. Of course, this is everyone getting their vaccines, which I'm a big proponent of. Okay, so we did all that, and we're trying to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic because we've had it. And then all of a sudden, we think we got a hold on it, and then we get another strain that pops up called the H2N2 strain. The reason I bring this up is because this is a direct lineage based on the 1918 influenza pandemic. Now, they put in everything they learned from the 1918 pandemic. They figured out how it's passed, they figured out how to prevent it, they figured out hygiene, they figured out how to treat it, they got vaccines for it, and they still had 1 million people died worldwide. And that's the way that's going to work. You're never going to prevent 100% of deaths. What they did prevent is they reduced everything by 100-fold, and that's pretty good rate after 40 years from the 1918. Now, vaccination strategies were employed that were developed in the late 40s. That was able to control the spread, but it was still able to spread. And then in 1968, so we had a little bit of a break, 1968, this same strain popped back up. The most important thing you learn about the 68 strain is that it is the progenitor strain or the early version of the H3N2 strain that we are dealing with today. And that's why I bring it up. It's because that lineage from 1968 is still with us in 2019. So some other things that happened that you need to be paid attention of is in 1977, there was a reemergence of the H1N1 at Fort Dix. President Ford at the time dropped the hammer on quarantine, gave everyone vaccinations, didn't see a case outside Fort Dix. That's probably a good thing. But in 1977, we had the Russian flu. The Russian flu came out because it was actually coming from a Eurasian swine flu that remnant very much similar to the 1918 influenza. So it affected another, again, this was what was the cause of concern, is that it started affecting people that were less than 25 years of age, which replicated similar to the 1918 strain. But they were able to keep it intact and isolate people from what we had learned from the previous one. And then the next one we had, which is the most recent one, is the 2009 H1N1 pandemic strain. And the reason I bring all that up is because, and you don't have to worry about so much the figures, just follow the colors, is that you can see the progenitor strain of 1918, which will be this one here, right here. I hope you can see that. It's a little blurry where I'm at. All of its genetic lineage can be traced into every single pandemic that we've had since 1918, including the 2009 strain. Just follow the colors. That's the easiest way to see it. This is currently the H3N2 seasonal strain, which was an offshoot of 57 and 68. And that's the current strain that we're dealing with now as it continues to mutate. H3N2 strain is a problem right now for us because it's starting to mutate at a rapid rate. Whenever we see an influenza virus start to mutate at a rapid rate, it usually means it's about to go pandemic. We saw that with the H1N1 in 2009. But all these lineages, as you can see here, they've all been able to trace some of their pathogenicity or their effect back to the 1918 strain. And that's what makes flu unique compared to other infectious disease pandemics. All right, so how are we going to prepare ourselves? Because the pandemic, you know it's coming. It's not if, it's when. So we have to prepare ourselves. That's why we have vaccines. That's why we spend $4 billion a year doing vaccine research for influenza, because we do not know which strain is going to be the next 1918 Spanish flu that could generate a pandemic. So seasonal influenza strains constantly change. That gives us potential. The H3N2, as I said, is the one that we had a problem with, and it's starting to work. So we're looking at different ways to generate the vaccine, because not everyone can get vaccinated. Some people have allergies. Some people can't stand the vaccine. So we go to more plant, or as I like to call it, organic vaccines, in order for people to be able to get vaccinated at multiple levels. We also are looking at going away with cells altogether and just using what we call mRNA vaccines, which is just genetic, in which we inject you with some genetic code and your body translated into a protein that then generates an immune response to it. Ipso facto, no problem whatsoever. Those are fun because you can you can generate a lot of doses in a short amount of time. But the one that I spend a lot of my time on is avian influenza. And that's the one to where we have the greatest concern about, because the 1918 strain was a direct transmission from an avian species. Don't know which one, just know that's where it came from. So we, and my group, and CDC, and NIAID, and Department of Public Health, and things of that nature, we do pandemic preparedness programs in which we surveil all the strains that are being isolated in birds that could potentially infect humans, and we generate vaccines for them and prepared for a potential pandemic. Don't know when, like I said, but we want to be prepared. So I want to talk about vaccines because I know some people didn't get a vaccine, and it's important to get a vaccine, even if the vaccine doesn't work. And I say this as a personal story because 2 years ago when the vaccine didn't work very well, I got a vaccine, I got the flu. What I didn't get was long-term flu. And what I call long-term is that it was able to be attenuated in a short amount of time because the vaccine will cause some protection. And just so if you have to explain it to your kids, just call it, viral software updates. They'll get that more often than anything else. But as a cartoon would say, sometimes it feels like the CDC and those in charge are just throwing darts at a board, and whatever hits is what they're going to go with. And I know it may seem that way, but there is a lot of effort that's put into it in order to determine what kind of strains are available for vaccinations. So, vaccines work. Get your vaccines for flu. If it doesn't work, it will still provide some level of protection to help you attenuate disease, so maybe you don't go into a secondary infection and get bacterial pneumonia, because your body will be able to fight it off at some level. Another thing that I like to talk about is herd immunity, and this is why vaccines become important. Not everyone in this room will be able to get a vaccine. That's just going to be the facts of life. Either autoimmunity, some type of immune compromisation, you just can't get the vaccine. But those who can should, because those who can become vaccinated can protect those who cannot. And this little cartoon gives you kind of a dispersion of what happens when people don't get vaccinated, and people who, only a few of us get vaccinated, and then when more of the population gets vaccinated. We try to shoot between 60 and 70% of the population to be vaccinated in order to protect most of those who cannot become vaccinated. And so this bottom one here kind of gives you the idea that we can present these islands of protection by people who can be vaccinated to be surrounded by those who can't. All right, so that's the end of my talk. Any questions?